Applied ethics in criminal justice. So a few terms in terms of applied ethics. Applied ethics is associated with normative ethics. So normative ethics, we would begin with an understanding of what people ought to do and what their moral duties are. There's three big dominant approaches: deontology, teleontology, and virtue ethics. Combined, these three approaches and their theorists aim to develop standards for what is right and wrong and the underlying logic for these approaches. Applied ethics is when one takes these principles and then applies them to a specific issue, such as the death penalty or use of force or sentencing issues in a criminal justice context. Associated with these terms is professional ethics, which is the applied ethics, but in the applied sense of a certain profession, such as police, court, and corrections. So people don't get confused in the audience. Applied ethics, just those terms, is referring to a specific issue and is not referring to applied in the sense of professional ethics. So that's an important distinction in terms of the terms. So philosophy begins with some, as one would expect, philosophical questions. And these are open-ended, usually what we call big picture questions, such as will religion ever become obsolete? Is there a meaning to life, and what is it? How does one define art? What's art and what is not art? How do you contribute to society? How do you maximize your life? How do you help yourself and those around you? So the questions are stated in a way that there is not necessarily a need to measure the outcomes. They can be approached in terms of logic or using normative ethics and the logic within those different approaches. However, when we move into social science and criminology specifically, we start to find a need for the use of scientific methods, and therefore our questions become more empirical. Empirical meaning measurable, and when following the scientific method, these big picture questions, these philosophical questions, often are tested and using a process of operationalization where you can take very loose concepts but then drill them down into measurable units and start to measure and test things in the real world. In criminal justice, we think about things about the relationship between mental illness and crime. So we have two variables there, mental illness and crime. Both can be defined, operationalized, and measured in some capacity, and then examined within the criminal justice system. So we're moving more from hypothetical questions into measurables, such as what's the impact of a dysfunctional upbringing on criminality later in life? How can police change strategies to effectively impact crime? What's the impact of differences in sentencing and issues of police practices? So these can all be measured. One thing about being a criminologist it's an interesting consideration when talking about applied ethics, is that it's one of those fields where people will tell you their beliefs pretty fast, and it doesn't matter if you're got previous expertise in the area. People will tell you, and they'll tell you in a very passionate manner, what their personal beliefs are. And over time, you come to realize that these beliefs, and they're on a lot of controversial topics in the criminal justice system, and but these beliefs that people have usually include a mix of a lot of different factors. So one of the first things that you'll find is your basic demographic differences or individual factors. Things like race, gender, socioeconomic status, peer group, political orientation, religious orientation, country of birth, um, these type of cultural effects as well. Um, they often fuel a lot of opinions on criminal justice topics. Um, People also enter the study of particular criminal justice topics with some sort of philosophical viewpoint, whether it's teleology, deontology, or virtue ethics. But they're usually looking at it through a lens to examine the problem, to make sense of a problem or an issue. To some extent, there is always the role of professional ethics, whether you're inside the system or not. Usually, they come to play. Um, Looking at, for example, police practices, a lot of people will check their own work practices. At my job, I'm expected to X, Y, and Z. I would or would not be allowed to do these things. So that comes up a lot in people's discussions of their perceptions. Um, to some extent, the empirical research, although this is people who have um, usually gone to college, majored in criminal justice, and understand what journals do and how information is produced in a non-biased manner and is current and very informative on a lot of these specific issues. Of course, the law, most of these criminal justice issues have some degree of legal precedence and court cases related to the topic. And of course, the ever present media, including social media. And media is a very, very big influence on perceptions. I personally wrote an article using criminal justice undergrad students as the sample, and they were asked some pretty basic questions before a prison tour, such as what does the typical prison look like? What do you expect the typical inmate to look like? Um, and what type of punishment orientations will you see going on? And it was very interesting to see how uninformed students were who were in the field of criminal justice and how influenced by the media they were. Shawshank Redemption emerged as a key media reference for students thinking of a prison tour. Of course, when they went on the tour, they didn't see this. They expected all sorts of brutality. They didn't see that. And there was a lot of false perceptions that just a simple tour could address. What you'll also find in applied ethics on criminal justice topics is even within an individual person, all of these factors can actually lead to a degree of cognitive dissonance. It's the state where you have inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes. And sometimes this can happen because things such as your individual or demographic background may actually clash to some degree with your professional ethics, may clash with the way things are portrayed on the media, for example. And so sometimes, even within a person, there will be kind of congruence or divergence in terms of how personal beliefs and opinions on these topics are made. We do know, however, that the criminal justice system as a whole is saturated with ethical issues. The process for offenders is usually interaction with police first. Then they may or may not be deferred to court processes, and following that, some sort of correctional system, which is includes institutional corrections of prisons and jails, and community corrections of parole and probation. It also includes things such as the health and well-being of staff who work in these systems. And so just thinking about what these systems do and what social problems they encounter and have to address themselves, it's certainly understandable that on a daily basis for practitioners in the system, for offenders in the system, and for all participants from lawyers, judges, and associated stakeholders, that ethical issues are a daily occurrence, and they are usually of some significance in criminal justice. And so it's important for practitioners to have some sense of how their own ethics either do converge or diverge from these other ethical systems when it focuses on a very specific applied criminal justice issue. So, thinking about one issue that is very rare actually in the system, but of course generates significant interest, is the topic of the death penalty. And this is just one issue that is an easy one to identify as having a very strong overlap with applied ethical discussions. So generally we start with the individual characteristics and we think to ourselves, well, what do I personally feel about the death penalty? Which crimes do I personally think, or do you think, should be punishable by death? None, of course, or any sort of mixture of the following: murder, terrorism, treason, rape, kidnapping, and so on. Now you see witchcraft down there, and of course the death penalty was applied for witchcraft. And so this list may change over time, but it's also important to get a sense of where your personal choices or perceptions are on this serious topic. Next, we can think about it empirically, and we can think about issues like public opinion. Since 1972, we can see that there's been probably the biggest drop and the lowest amount of support in support of the death penalty, based on the question: are you in favor of the death penalty for a person convicted of murder? This is a Gallup poll, by the way. In favor has ranged anywhere from a fairly low point now, 54%, to a high of about 80%. It shows that in the US context, over a period of time, there is still a majority of people that support the death penalty for a person convicted of murder. However, the number does fluctuate and currently has dropped. So that's kind of an empirical way of starting to think about this topic. Then, of course, we can think about arguments for or against. If we're thinking about it in terms of a public opinion, certainly there's articles which show some basics that the support for capital punishment is often found in public opinion, that people believe that it deters would-be murderers from killing people in the future. Supporters of the death penalty argue it provides closure for the victim's family, that it helps stop people from committing the same crime twice, and that it's an eye for an eye or a life for a life, that the punishment should fit the crime. Now, some of these arguments have been certainly dismissed through empirical evidence, such as closure for the victim's family. In some cases, that's correct. Research suggests that the victim's family often have very different reactions, and some victims' families actually support not executing the offender. Matthew Shepard's family, for example, and that may have led to the offender not being executed or not being given the death penalty. And the deterrence effect has also been greatly devalued through empirical evidence. But in terms of public opinion, these are some of the things that against capital punishment. Public opinion, people tend to say that they oppose it because life is valuable, and even the worst criminals shouldn't have taken that away. The idea that an innocent person has been in the past and likely would be in the future sentenced to death. The challenge to the death penalty, and the moral argument that the identification of murder as being a universal wrong is not righted by executing a person. That's actually just replicating that same moral wrong. So arguments for and arguments against, both of which can be tested empirically and have been in the criminological literature and in other literature such as law and so on. Now, if we think of it in a more normative ethical approach, the arguments for, well, we can think consequential arguments that it once again talks about deterrence. Executing hardened murderers takes away any risk of future consequences. If we think about arguments for in terms of deontology, we're thinking about retribution. Once again, proportional to the crime. You take a life, your life should be taken. And that retribution is not a revenge issue. It comes from a desire to inflict suffering. It's about justice. So this is the same type of arguments, but rather than moving towards empiricism or testing, we're still staying in the realm of philosophy here, or just in the phrasing in applied philosophical sense. In the same way, the argument against the death penalty, consequentialists would state that life in prison without parole is just as effective in execution, and it results in greater overall happiness or goodness for society as a whole. Consequentialists would talk about the likelihood of executing an innocent, and that happiness for society would be diminished if that was to occur. And deontology, human beings have an inherent value, dignity, and a right to life. Therefore, that basic moral structure of a human should override it being removed. Punishment should fit the crime, and the death penalty is unjust because it doesn't fit the crime. So here's in the a philosophical for or against approach. Here's another way to look at it, and thinking about backward justifications and forward justifications, and logical ways of thinking about the arguments. So one interesting side note in an article by Robert Boehm, who's an expert on death penalty, was actually conducted on college students, and it's called More Than 10 Years After, the Long-Term Stability of Informed Death Penalty Opinions. So what Dr. Boehm did in this experiment was look at perceptions in a classroom on a specialty topic just on the death penalty alone. So this was a class in which students would take, and it was just on the death penalty. That was the entire semester work. What he found was, in collecting data from the class, was that after taking the class, there was an increase in opposition to the death penalty. So the students did seem to offer support in opposition, or rather support for the death penalty kind of dropped after taking the class. 2 or 3 years later, it went back to the initial levels, and 10 years later there was very, very small increases. Other things such as personal involvement in crime or being a victim did not seem to make any impact. It's just that it seems that these students, and with a long-term follow-up, basically regress back to their original beliefs, perceptions, and values that were all associated with their opinions on the death penalty. Um, as I said earlier, when we consider these applied ethical issues, we also think about the law. So, with the death penalty, we have to think about what occurred in 1976 with the case of Gregg versus Georgia, which legalized capital punishment after it had been stopped for over a decade. They resumed 6 months later in about 1977, so the following year, and Gary Gilmore, who was a serial killer, was executed, and in Utah, he had the right to request a different form of execution. He selected firing squad, and after the death, it was discovered that he didn't die for 2 minutes afterwards, and that it was a kind of an ugly and gory way to go, particularly for even the victim's family who was watching. Other methods have been tried, obviously, in modern history. Hanging was used often, but they found that it often would take minutes for the person to suffocate. The gas chamber was used, and that had some of the worst botched executions, as the victims' families would look on and the person would be gasping for breath. The same applies to electrocution, where there would be all sorts of smells and horrific sights for the people watching it. This all led to concerns about Eighth Amendment requirements for human rights. And so over time, these other methods were abandoned, and in its place, the lethal injection process was used. The other issue that then emerged was, what is the ethical role of medical professionals, staff such as doctors, nurses, etc. What is their role in the death penalty process? Remembering their normative ethics, or rather their professional ethics, first do no harm. The idea that physicians are healers, they're not executioners, but also the obvious need for health professionals in reducing all of these previous botched executions to make the process less painful and more efficient in terms of not hurting the person. So following Gregg versus Georgia and the continued practice of the death penalty in corrections, the American Medical Association quickly made statements regarding the healthcare professionals' role in the death penalty. The statement reads, "A physician as a member of a profession dedicated to preserving life when there is hope of doing so should not be a participant in legally authorized execution. Although an individual physician's opinion about capital punishment remains the personal moral decision of the individual." So they made a very clear statement. While corrections, such as prisons where these were conducted, still overly favored this method of execution. One of the reasons is that it relied on established anesthesia techniques. It felt much more like a medical procedure than the grisly botched executions that had happened in the past, or the dramatic effects. In certain states, the executions were even moved to a prison hospital procedure room, and officials could turn to doctors and nurses with technical difficulties, asking what could be done. Um, but following this statement in 1980, um, it was fairly clear that the AMA said that staff would be unacceptable to be involved in the administration of medications as part of the execution procedure. Even they said no monitoring of vital signs, no rendering technical advice, no selection of injection site, no starting or supervising the intravenous lines in which the drugs are fed, or not representing oneself or being present in the role as a physician. Um, there was also, the AMA said that pronouncing death for these staff would be considered unacceptable because the physician is not permitted to revive the prisoner if he or she is found to be alive. As far back as 1980, the AMA stated that only two actions were acceptable: the provision at the prisoner's request of a sedative to calm anxiety beforehand, and certification of death after another person had pronounced it. So what we're left with is a medicalization of the death penalty, but it's still the responsibility of prison administrators who are often not trained, um, and the result is still an ethical dilemma, or an applied ethical issue rather, that continues to challenge correctional staff. Cases like this is rather outdated, but there's more recent ones. 1982, several medical directors attended a lethal injection, but just in the role of pronouncing death following another person. They were then asked to violate their professional ethics, to give advice on where to give the injection. They watched. The syringe did not work. It had not been mixed correctly. The doctor said, "I could have told you how to do that correctly." When they were asked to pronounce the prisoner, the inmate dead, they found them still alive. And they were then somewhat co-opted into were they part of the team or not. So we're left with this contemporary issue in which courts and legislation should not ask physicians to violate ethical standards to solve problems that really are legal challenges too. We're still left with a correctional system that is responsible for performing executions, which is an ethical consideration unto itself. And the role of medical professions still has certain grey areas, although the Code of Ethics and medical groups such as AMA are fairly clear on where they stand on the issue. There is a few studies in which the medical professionals who do still choose to participate in executions and who are comfortable self-identifying explain their rationale for being involved. This usually centers on the idea that these events are going to these executions are going to happen anyway, and the medical professional places themselves in conducting a procedure as painless as possible in the interest of the inmate who is being put to death. So there is also some empirical evidence here about medical professionals who still choose to be involved in executions. I believe they just get messages from the AMA and other groups rather than their license revoked or anything for their involvement. So this is one issue. It obviously has more to it, but starts with discussion of the death penalty, and then moves into the intersection of health workers, coupled with the legal system for the death penalty, and a continued ethical dilemma that certainly applies to applied ethics. As I said earlier, criminal justice topics such as the death penalty are very common in the field of applied ethics. Applied ethics deals with all sorts of topics, but the death penalty is usually one of the prime ones that they take from criminal justice. Of course, there is a number of other issues that one could examine as their own topics in applied ethics. In the media now, we see lots of issues with use of force by police and the impact of community policing strategies. In the court system, there's ongoing ethical discussions about sentencing juveniles as adults and what are the implications of that. Corrections, there continues to be discussions on the impact of solitary confinement on inmates, particularly mentally ill inmates. It seems to have an adverse effect. Re-entry strategies for the large number of inmates re-entering society in order to reduce recidivism. In the field of probation and parole, the use of technology. So we're thinking about all these systems and all these particular issues, and there's a lot. But then you also consider criminal justice topics extending to public health, mental health, drug and alcohol services, domestic violence and intimate partner services, and homelessness, and all the other millions of other agencies. You can see that there's a reason that the newspaper is usually filled with criminal justice issues of the day. To return to just a general discussion about applied ethics as a final kind of consideration is applied ethics focuses on specific controversial moral issues. Of course, within applied ethics, we have subfields. I just discussed the death penalty in the subfield of criminal justice ethics. Of course, the same topic relates to medical ethics. You also have business ethics and other forms. For an issue to be considered an applied ethical issue, it usually has to have two requirements. The first one is that the topic itself is controversial, and that a significant number of people are both for and against the issue at hand. That it doesn't have to be an exact 50-50 split, but there seems to be some sort of for and against argument. So one example is the murder of innocent people for no reason. Well, there's not a lot of controversy there, so it is important, but most people would say that's an unethical act. But when you talk about other issues in criminal justice, such as the death penalty, gun control, police practices, incarceration rates, all these type of things, you do find that people will be split somewhat down the middle on this controversial topic. The second issue, in order for it to be an applied ethical issue, is that the issue itself has to have some underlying distinct morality involved to it. So some of the issues may be issues of social policy, whereas an applied ethical issue should have some sort of moral implication. So, for example, a social policy could be things such as police practices on speeding, drug sentencing. A moral issue, however, focuses on universal practices such as a duty to avoid lying, what is socially immoral versus what is prohibited. So those two requirements. Now, one does not need those two requirements in doing empirical work and measuring things, but when talking about an applied ethical topic, it's best to pick one that has some underlying moral kind of discussion point. As mentioned, there's other forms of applied ethics. Biomedical ethics, for example, is probably the most diverse and extreme category. It pretty much touches every life and death issue. It touches all issues when we go to the doctor, from prenatal to your confidentiality to screening to end of life care. Biomedicine is a massive area of ethics, as it should be. Criminal justice is what we discussed today, which involves police, courts, or corrections systems and the staff. Business ethics, of course, involves business practices within capitalism. It often can intersect criminal justice when we talk about things like insider trading, um, employee rights, deceptive advertising, affirmative action, drug testing, job discrimination, and whistleblowing. And environmental ethics that also can on occasion overlap with criminal justice, such as animal rights, pollution, and so on. As a final consideration, when we think about applied ethics, um, one interesting way to think about it is that ethical theories as a whole are divided into three general approaches or subject areas. The first one is meta-ethics. This this approach is the biggest picture of the three. The questions that it asks is where do ethics actually come from? Are they social inventions by humans? Do they involve more than our individual emotions? Um, what are universal truths? Is there something that's called the will of God? What is the role of reason in ethical judgment? And what's the meaning of ethical terms? So these are very broad, big picture types of questions and ways to think about ethics. The next level down, we have normative ethics that takes a much more practical approach. Here, what we're looking at is to arrive at a moral standard that we can regulate right and wrong conduct, and we can have reasons for right and wrong behavior. This may involve articulating the good habits that we should inquire, the duties that we should follow, or the consequences of our behaviors on others. An example is the golden rule: do unto others as you would want done to you. Okay. So once again, that bears worth repeating. Uh, Good habits that we should acquire, which refers to virtue ethics. The duties that we should follow, and the consequences of our behavior on others. Uh, the final point or the final approach is applied ethics. So we're moving from more abstract philosophical approaches to a specific issue. This is the study of a specific controversial issue. Outside the criminal justice realm, or probably more outside the realm, applied ethics focuses on things like abortion, animal rights, environmental concerns, homosexuality, but also, of course, within we're thinking about capital punishment and all of the other type of things that we talked about. So this is the way to examine ethical theories when they're placed within these three approaches, which kind of complement each other.